Okay, good. I look forward to seeing it. Okay, let's do some learning tonight. Good to have you back here with us. We're continuing with our discussion of the Aron Kodesh in the Mishkan, so certainly appropriate, 446. So the Torah tells us, we learned about the basic construction of the Aron Kodesh, that it was essentially 3 boxes inlaid one within the other, a golden box, a wooden box, and then a golden box. And ultimately there was something on top of it, which we'll come to. We're not yet ready for that. But let's look, the Torah tells us something about the way in which the Aron Kodesh was carried. So look on page 446, Pasuk 12, Pasuk Yud Beis, the Torah says, V'yatzakta lo arba tabaos zahav. V'yatzakta, what does the word v'yatzakta mean? So the English translates it as you shall cast, right? Casting is a way of making or creating a metal. Interesting, if you look at Rashi, you see that Rashi mentions the term v'yatzakta, says Rashi, lashon hatacha, right? Lashon hatacha. Rashi is in the left column, the 3rd line down. Lashon hatacha. Interesting. How do you say metal in Hebrew? Anybody know how you say metal in Hebrew? Matechet, right? Matechet is metal, so lashon hatacha is the word for metal, so meaning basically casting. So these tabaot were cast. Now, just keep that in mind. That when we generally think about this, we would think that they cast the rings. Right. There was a mold, and in the mold they would pour the molten metal, and as it would cool, right, they would remove the mold, and you would have your metal object, whatever it was. Right? Basically the casting process. So did they make the rings and then attach the rings to the Aron Kodesh, or did they do it a little bit differently? If you look at the picture at the bottom of page 447, you'll see that there you see on the left side and the right side of the Aron, there are 2 sticks, staves, which is a fancy word for sticks, badim, and these badim go through rings. So these are the rings that we're talking about, right? These particular rings. And the Torah tells us that there were 4 rings, v'yatzakta lo arba tabaos, you shall cast lo for it, for the Aron, arba tabaos zahav, 4 golden rings, v'nasata al arba pa'amosav, and you shall place them on the 4 pa'amotav. You shall place them on the 4 pa'amotav. So the question is, what are the pa'amotav?
That's what pa'amon means, a bell.
Well, pa'amon means a bell, all right? Here, what does pa'amotav mean here? So if you look at Rashi again in the left column, the 3rd line, Rashi says, pa'amotav kitargumo zaviteha. What is this zavit? Corner or side. Corner or side. Well, really corner. Okay, let's go by corner. Zavit is a corner. And if you look in the English, what does it say? You shall cast for it 4 rings of gold and place them on its 4 corners. Right? So it translates, Rashi translates pa'amotav as corners, right? Zaviot, based on the Targum, based on the Aramaic translation. And therefore we have 4 tabaot on the 4 corners. Okay, good. Now what's interesting, and if you look at the picture, you see the rings on the corners. Now the rings, right, imagine, right, if you have a corner like this, right, this is a corner, so the ring wasn't attached at the diagonal. The ring had to be attached on one side or the other. And if you look here, you'll see it was attached on the narrow side. The rings were attached on the narrow side of the Aron Kodesh. Remember, how big was the Aron Kodesh? So its length was 2.5 amot, and amma is about 1.5 feet. So 2.5 amot is, right? 2 amot is, so how big? How much? 4 foot 6 inches.
30 inches?
30. All right. An amma is 30 inches. So 4 times. So it was 2.5 amot. So an amma is 1.5 feet. Two amot is 3 feet, and another half an amma is 8 inches, right? So 18 inches, right? So 4 feet 6 inches.
The size of the carry-on?
75 inches divided by 12.
So 4 feet 6 inches. Okay, how big is 4 feet 6 inches? Okay, you can imagine. Okay, 4 feet 6 inches, and how wide was the Aron? That was its length. How wide was it? No, all of the measurements of the Aron Kodesh were in halves. 1.5. Right? So 1.5 is how much? 2 foot 3 inches. Okay, 2 foot 3 inches. Right? 4 feet 6 inches the long way, 2 feet 3 inches the narrow way. Okay, and
Not that big, but heavy,
not that big at all.
but heavy. Look at all the gold.
Well, if you remember, we learned about what fit into it and how it fit in. If you remember, okay. So that's the size of the Aron. Let me see if I can just open this. Just like that. Okay, right. That's the size of the Aron, and the rings were attached to the narrow side of the Aron. The question is, why were the rings attached to the narrow side of the Aron? The Torah doesn't tell us which side to attach it. The Torah simply says it's attached at the pa'amon, at the corner. The way Rashi understands it, at the corner. It doesn't tell us whether to attach it, on the long side or to attach it on the short side. The Gemara in Maseches Menachos, the Gemara assumes that it was attached on the short side, on the 1.5 amma side.
You need less staves.
What?
You need less length on the staves. How long staves?
Mm-hmm.
That's true. Just less-
That is true.
Less clumsy, less clumsy.
You do need less length of the staves, but we're actually going to see that the staves were a standard length. But what's the reason for this?
Balance, maybe?
Not balanced. The Gemara in Maseches Menachos describes the way in which the Aron Kodesh was carried. How many Kohanim carried the Aron Kodesh? The- I'm sorry, Kahas, right? Kahas. How many of Kahas carried the Aron Kodesh? 4. There were 4. They carried it, 2 in the front and 2 in the back. They carried it on their shoulders. Now, the Gemara says, if we're dealing with, they walked in between the staves. They didn't carry it on, they weren't on the outside. The Gemara says they were in between the staves. And in between the staves, there was how much room?
Not too much.
Well, think about it. In between the staves.
Enough for 2 people.
Enough for 2 people. Well, how much room was there? So if the staves were attached as we suggested, as this picture depicts, that they were attached to the narrow side of the Aron Kodesh, that means there were 2.5 amot, 4 feet 6 inches, for 2 people to stand and to walk. Says the Gemara, 2 people can stand and walk in 4 feet 6 inches. But if the staves were attached to the longer end, that would mean what? How were they being carried? No, they had to be in the inside. The Gemara says it was impossible because you can't fit two people with room to walk in the span of an amma and a half, right? What do we say? 2 feet 6 inches. You can't fit two people there. So a little bit of a better illustration of this is if you look at the handout that I gave you. This handout is from the book called The Tabernacle, and this is a bird's eye view looking down on top of the Kodesh HaKodashim. Right? You are looking down at the top of the Aron Kodesh. Right? This is the Kodesh HaKodashim here. You're looking down at the top of the Aron Kodesh. These are the staves that are here. So you see how there's more room here. Imagine if the staves were attached on this side, there would be no room to walk. So that's how the Gemara in Maseches Menachos interprets this passage from the Chumash, that the rings were attached on the corners on the narrow side, giving the family of Kahas room to walk in between the badim and to carry it on their shoulders. Now, interestingly, if you look here in the picture at the bottom of page 447, what do you see? If I were to ask you to tell me how far down on the corner of the Aron are the rings, what would you tell me? How far down are they?
9 inches.
9. Oh, that's interesting.
Quarter of the way down.
Let's say, well, there's a difference, right? An attorney and an architect, right? Let's say a quarter of the way down, okay? They're a quarter of the way down. Do we have any indication in the pasuk where on the corner these rings were found? Does the Torah tell us anywhere where on the corner these rings are found? No, it doesn't, right? It doesn't say at all where they would be found. They were just simply, v'nasata, you shall place it, the rings, al arba pa'amosav, on the 4 pa'amosav, according to Rashi, the 4 corners. The way in which Rashi understands it, the 4 corners, but it doesn't tell us where on the 4 corners these rings were placed. Okay, correct? Look at Rashi. Rashi, again, on the left column, the 3rd line, at the very end of the line, the last 2 words, Rashi says, ubizaviot ha'elyonot samoch leparochet hayu nitunim. Where were they? On the corner, right, the upper corner, meaning the top part of the corner, samuch la kaporis, right, near the kaporis, near the cover. That's where they were placed. Shtayim mikan ushtayim mikan, right, 2 over here and 2 over here. Lerichavo shel Aron, they were on the width side, the narrow side of the Aron. V'habadim nisonim bahem, and the staves were placed through these rings. V'arko shel Aron mafsik bein habadim, amasayim v'chetzi bein bad lebad, shehiyu b'nei shnei b'nei adam hanosines ha'aron mehachin beinehem. What says Rashi? Exactly what I just explained, that if they were on the narrow side, the rings were on the narrow side, that means that the space between the badim was 2.5 amot, which was enough room for 2 people to walk, and Rashi quotes the Gemara in Menachos as this source. This is the source from the Gemara of Menachos.
I wouldn't nitpick on the minutia, but that's exactly what he's doing, so I'll play along.
That's exactly what who's doing.
Rashi and, the whole
Go ahead,
thing
go ahead, play along.
First of all, I don't know how these rings are secured to the Aron.
Okay, good question. Excellent question.
Are there screws through it? Are there pinholes? Are they drilled through? Whatever else? Are they molded on? I'm not sure. And theoretically, you could actually have them secured to the long side with a little bit of the hemicircle or a greater part of it extended, and have the staves go through it too. Theoretically, you construct it any of a number of the ways.
Oh, that's correct. You could construct it any of a number of ways, but that's why we have a Masorah, and the Masorah suggests to us how it's supposed to be.
But also within that description, my way is just as legitimized, except for the Masorah component.
That's well. You're exactly right, and it's the Masorah component that is what we right. That's really what we focus on.
Why is this all so important?
Why is this?
Exactly how the ring is
We're
working.
gonna build another one.
Why is it
The
important?
detail, this kind of detail.
Well, I mean, we see a lot of. You could ask that question, I think, about a lot of things, right? About a lot of things. In other words, why are all of these details so important? And we know there are tremendous details when we get, and we're just scratching the surface right now. When we start to talk about like the menorah and the shulchan, we get tremendous detail as to how these things are built, and we actually will see that there are sort of moral lessons to be derived from these things. It's not simply, it is a blueprint, and it's not simply a blueprint. It's a blueprint that has a certain divine message that's associated with it, which we'll come to. But first we have to understand what the pasuk says, right? The pasuk is, as Eddie points out, the pasuk is deliberately vague, and we need a Masorah in order to be able to understand it. Because without a Masorah, Eddie's right, you could construct it in a different kind of way. Because the Torah is not specific on which side it goes. Go ahead, Tina.
Question. Today, in contemporary life, we also have an Aron Kodesh. We also have a place where it looks sort of like a mizbeach. I mean, how much does the contemporary architecture of a shul take from this? And because all the shuls basically have that Aron Kodesh architecture, do we glean as much as we can from the original?
We say that a shul is a mikdash ma'at, right? That a shul is a small microcosm of the Mishkan, right? A mikdash ma'at, a small sanctuary, if you will. So yes, there are certain things that are patterned after the Mishkan, after the /Beis HaMikdash. Absolutely. So for instance, the Shulchan in the center, right? This became actually a very significant question early on in the development of conservative Judaism, right? If you go into a Reform shul, where is the Shulchan? If you go into a Reform synagogue, where do they read the Torah from?
Your back is to the Aron, right? And your front is to the...
Where is the place where they read the Torah from? It's up front. Where does the cantor daven from? Up front, right? Everything is up front.
Not in the middle.
Not in the middle. Everything is up front, and in many conservative synagogues as well, the bima, if you will, was moved to the front. And in Orthodox synagogues, it remains in the center. In Orthodox synagogues, it remains in the center. And this was actually, I love to tell the story. I don't know if I've told it to you before, but before there was a Great Neck synagogue, there was a Reform synagogue, Temple Bethel, and there was a conservative synagogue, Temple Israel. Rabbi Waxman, Alav Hashalom, was the rabbi of Temple Israel, and Herman Wouk was one of his members. Herman Wouk was one of the founders of the Great Neck Synagogue. Herman Wouk came from a more traditional background, and the apocryphal story as it's told, and I have no independent corroboration of this, since independent corroboration seems to be the topic of discussion these days. I have no independent corroboration of this, but I am told, this was the apocryphal story, that depending upon who got to shul first on Sunday morning, that's who determined where the bima was. That if Herman Wouk got to shul before Rabbi Waxman, he moved the bima into the center of the Beis Medrash. And if Rabbi Waxman got there before Herman Wouk, he prevented Herman Wouk from moving it into the center. So that was a little bit of the, if you will, back and forth between Herman Wouk and And again, over the placement of the bima, and yes, you can have a whole discussion about the architecture of the modern shul and how it relates to the construction of the Mishkan and Mikdash. And maybe when we're finished, the details of this, of the entirety of the Mishkan, we can look at how that picture comes together. Mike?
So the rings were made entirely of gold, and the ark was like reinforced, not pure gold, it was reinforced with gold cover, but it was reinforced
With wood.
Wood. So structurally speaking, gold is a relatively soft metal.
Right?
How would these rings of minimal size be weight-bearing, made out of pure gold? How would be a miracle?
Well, I think that was a little bit of Eddie's question. Right, a little bit of Eddie's question is how do you do this, right? How do you make these rings? What?
He focused on the method of attachment.
Right.
But it's hainuhach. I mean, it's the same question, right? In other words, the method of attachment determines how weight-bearing it's going to be. So for instance, if you drilled through the gold and the wood and the inner gold, and then you attached it with a bolt, that might be, the wood itself might be strong enough to bear the weight, because the weight rested on these rings, which were on the staves that were placed through the rings. Or perhaps we can learn, this is interesting, perhaps we can learn, and there is such an opinion, and we'll see in a minute where it comes from. Maybe there were 2 sets of rings for each corner. In other words, one set of rings that was molded into the gold, that was a part and parcel of the gold, and another ring that was molded in, that was sort of like this, right, like this, and a bigger ring that was like this, and the staves went through the bigger ring. Why that might be, we'll come and see in a minute. But that might be an answer to your question also, Mike. The truth is, the Torah doesn't tell us, right? It just says vinasata, right? You shall put it. Does that mean you put it afterwards? Does it mean you put it before? It's not clear. Tina.
This is a technical question. You said that gold is soft metal, right?
Yes.
And very ductile and very malleable.
Okay. If this is taken into battle, battles are hot, right? I mean, with all the, I'm thinking of battles maybe today, but we wonder if anything could melt it if it was if the heat.
Gold's melting point is very, very high.
Yeah, I don't think it's.
As I'm looking at the language of the Tasa, the earlier references talks about the Tzapita, Oto, Zahav, Tahor.
Pure.
That's pure gold, whereas it doesn't say pure gold with respect to the Tabao.
Correct.
So it's possible that it was some kind of
Alloy.
An alloy. In other words, the pure the gold.
But that doesn't answer your question as to how it was attached.
That's his question.
Right.
My question is how would it be weight bearing as a metal if it was just pure gold?
Right, but I understand, I hear what you're saying. Well, I don't know, if you take a gold ring, can you bend a gold ring with your hands?
Pure gold.
The gold that we have is the gold that's used for jewelry and stuff.
Is an alloy.
But 18 karat gold is very soft.
24 karat.
What?
24 karat gold.
24 karat gold is very
But if you have a golden ring, I don't think you can bend it like that.
Bulky gold ingot, for example.
If you have a rod, you can bend it.
If you had a gold rod, you could
Yeah, I'm
bend
not
it.
talking about a thick rod, but a thin enough rod, it bends very easily. Gold is very ductile, it's made into wires.
Okay. So, all right, so let's come back to this. So this is a good question, Mike, how it was, whether it could be weight bearing or how was it weight bearing? And maybe indeed it was an alloy, it was gold with something else because it doesn't say tahor. It's an interesting point. Eddie, how it was attached is another subject of discussion. Whether it was attached to, whether it was attached externally, was it melted on? And if it was melted on, is that sufficient to, is that sufficient to bear the weight of it? But let's come back for a moment to the question that I asked and the question that Rashi deals with. Rashi says it was on the upper third, or I'm sorry, the upper portion of the corner, near the kapores, near the, well, it's hard to tell from this picture, but it's easier to tell from the picture in the Chumash.
Yeah, but the picture they distributed also showed it at the top.
I'm sorry?
The rings are shown at the top.
Oh, yeah, but we don't know if those rings are at the top or, we're looking bird's eye down, so it's almost impossible to determine
This is a better picture.
where those rings are. The picture in Chumash on page 447 at the bottom seems to indicate that they were, that they were on the upper part of the corner, as Rashi suggests, and that is indeed the Mesorah. That most of the Meforshim understand that it was on the upper side, on the upper part of the
Tippy top.
of the corner, not at the tippy top, but on the upper part of the corner. Interesting, right? Interesting. The not everybody agrees with that. Not everybody agrees with that. Here's a question, and a question I never thought about until I saw this. When they set the Aron Kodesh down, right, wherever it was going to be set up, they put the Aron Kodesh down. What did they put it down on?
Doesn't say.
Well,
Did it just sit on the ground?
Well, wasn't, in Nach, isn't there a situation where they're parading the Aron Kodesh back to Yerushalayim
That's what
and
you, that's
someone,
what Doug is.
and like it's beginning to fall to the ground,
It was in a wagon.
but it was beginning to fall, and someone like tried to rescue it from falling, and he was
Killed.
Yeah.
Yeah, correct.
For the mere act, so.
Touching.
It seems like touching.
Touching, yeah.
But it seems like he was saving it from touching the ground. It sounds like he would do it right.
Well,
I would think that they would be padding, some kind of padding or something.
okay, so Mike,
Scratched on the bottom.
so Mike thinks there would be something underneath it, some kind of padding underneath it. So you're approaching it from the perspective of, hey, it's gold on the bottom. You put the gold down directly on the earth, what's it going to do? It's going to scratch it, right? So maybe there was some kind of padding underneath it. It's logical, right? It's logical, but it doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's logical, it makes sense, but we don't have any reference to it, right? We don't see anywhere that there's reference to it. Listen to what the Ibn Ezra says here. The Ibn Ezra is, not everybody goes according to the traditional understanding, but let me share with you what the Ibn Ezra says. Says the Ibn Ezra, Chipasti bechol hamikra. I looked throughout all of Chumash, maybe all of Tanakh, velo matzasi pa'am shehu zavis. And I never found the term pa'am used to denote a corner. Right? Because remember, what did Rashi say? Rashi said, kitargumo, according to its Aramaic translation, zaviot, which Rashi interprets as corners, which the English interprets as corners, based obviously on Rashi. And as all of the designs seem to indicate, it was on the corner. Rashi goes so far as to tell us it was on the top of the corner, right? We know it was on the narrow side, top of the corner, near the kapores. But the Ibn Ezra says it doesn't make sense. The only usage I find in Tanakh for the word pa'am is milashon regel. Right? That what is it? It's milashon regel. What is regel?
A foot.
A foot.
So maybe it had these things on the bottom.
Right? It's I don't know, maybe. Right? It had something according to the, and then he brings a number of psukim where pa'am is described as the foot of something, right? Connected to regel. And what does the Ibn Ezra suggest? Al kain, therefore, hitzrachti lefaresh, I'm forced to interpret this to say, ki raglayim hayu la'aron. This is a Peladic interpretation. You look everywhere you look, every picture of the Aron you ever look at, you don't, cute pun, you don't see any right? You don't see any picture like this.
Yeah.
Says the Ibn Ezra, I'm forced to say, I have no choice. I'm forced to say that pa'am means regel, and that there were raglayim to this Aron Kodesh. That it didn't sit on the ground, it sat on these feet. And listen to what he says. Ki derech bizaryon hu sheyeshev ha'aron ba'aretz. It's a lack of respect to put the Aron Kodesh directly on the floor.
I like this.
Right? So says the Ramban, what was there? There were raglayim. There were little feet. He doesn't describe whether they look like that or what kind of feet they were, but there were feet on the bottom of the Aron Kodesh. Nice interpretation, right? Doesn't sit on the ground. It's elevated off the ground, more respectful, good. It fits linguistically according to the Ibn Ezra. Very nice. What's our problem?
Doesn't say.
What?
Doesn't
Well,
say
he's
it.
interpreting that.
Oh, it doesn't say no.
It's a
We don't know what this word means.
instructing what the structure is. So.
We don't know what the word pa'am means here, right? We have Rashi's interpretation and we have the Ibn Ezra's interpretation. Two completely separate interpretations. Rashi says it's a corner. The Ibn Ezra says it's a foot. But what's the problem? The problem is, according to the pasuk, where was the ring attached? The ring was attached to the pa'amot, to the pa'amotav, right? The ring was attached, according to Rashi, to its corners, hence the picture that you have at the bottom of page 447. According to the Ibn Ezra, where was the ring attached? To the feet. The ring was attached, right? The ring was attached to the feet. What is that? What's going on here? So listen to what the Ibn Ezra says. The Ibn Ezra now turns his attention, interestingly, right? Because we all have the question, right? If it went through, if these rings were attached to the feet, and the poles went through the rings at the feet, at the bottom, what's the question? Well, it's easy. You just lift it up on your shoulders, right? And in fact, what the Ibn Ezra is going to suggest, maybe we'll see, is maybe that makes even more sense. Because what are you doing? The lower the poles are, well, the harder the lift, but the higher the Aron Kodesh sits when it's being carried. In other words, if the rings are the way Rashi describes them, the way they are here in the picture, when you carry it, right, part of the Aron Kodesh is like equal to your body. And part of it, yes, sticks up a little bit, but not that much of it. But if the rings are at the bottom, so then what happens? If the rings are at the bottom, then it lifts higher. That might be more kavadik for the Aron Kodesh. But now let's go back to the pasuk for a second. I'm going to come back to the Ibn Ezra. I don't want you to forget it, but let's come back now and we'll see what the Ibn Ezra builds on. So let's look at the pasuk one more time. What does the pasuk say? V'yatzakta lo arba pa'amos tabaos zahav v'nasata al arba pa'amosav. Okay, now that's the first part of the pasuk. Let's look at the second part of the pasuk. What does the second part of the pasuk say? Ushte, the vav. Ushte tabaos, and two rings, outsalo ha'echas, on one side, ushte tabaos, and two rings, outsalo hashenis, on the second side. Here comes the question. Is the second part of the pasuk explaining the first part of the pasuk? Or is the second part of the pasuk in addition to the first part of the pasuk? What would Rashi say? Rashi would say the second part of the pasuk is explaining the first part of the pasuk. Exactly. What would the Ibn Ezra say? The Ibn Ezra would say, guess what? You know how many rings there were? There were 8 rings. There were rings on the feet. And then, in addition to, and that's the first part of the pasuk. And in addition to that, there were rings on the corners. What was the purpose of the rings on the feet? So listen now to the Ibn Ezra. Says the Ibn Ezra, Va'od, as he's explaining this, he says, Va'od, Ma ta'am lomar, what's the reason for the pasuk to say, Ushtei taba'os zahav b'tosefes havav? What does it have to say, Ushtei, right? Ushtei, with adding the vav. The vav is mosif.
Yeah.
Right? So says the Ibn Ezra, therefore, what do we have to say? We have to say 4 rings, right? A ring attached to each of the feet, and then
And the other rings.
4 rings, 2 on each side. The rings, 2 on each side, is how they carried it. And what was the purpose of the rings on the feet? So listen to this. He explained... what was the purpose? He said, let me just looking for the wording. He says it was liyofi, right? It was so that it would look, they were adornments. The rings that were on the feet were adornments to the aron, and the rings that were on the sides, those were the rings by which the aron was carried. Less.
It says you shall cast only 4 rings.
Well, I don't see anywhere where it says only.
It says you shall cast 4 rings.
Okay, you added the word only. I don't see the word only in there. It says, you shall cast 4 rings, which are to be attached to what? To the
4 corners.
to the corners, which is a translation according to Rashi. But if you would translate it according to the Ibn Ezra, what would he say? You cast 4 rings to be attached to the feet, and then look what happens. Now, look in the English. What does it say? You shall cast for it 4 rings of gold and place them on its 4 corners. Comma. What does the English leave out? What's the next word? The next word in Hebrew is vav, v'ushte, and 2. What does the English leave out? The word and. It just says 2, right? Why does it leave out the word and? Because the English wants to follow Rashi's opinion, right? The English wants to follow Rashi's opinion, who says that the vav is meaningless, right? But the Ibn Ezra says, no, the vav is not meaningless. What does the vav mean? The vav means, and in addition, right? Cast 4 rings for its 4 feet, ushte, and 2 rings for each side, making 8 rings in total. Interesting. Let's go back to Rashi for a second. Okay, look at what Rashi says. We're on the left column. Count up from the bottom of the page. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Obviously, Rashi was sensitive to this as well. 5 lines up from the bottom of the page. What does Rashi say? Ushtei tabaos al tzal'o he'achas. Says Rashi, hein dalet tabaos shebet chilas hamikra. Right? The next 4 rings that we're hearing about, these are the 4 rings that we read about at the beginning of the pasuk. Rashi says the second part of the pasuk is coming to explain the first part of the pasuk. Upiresh lecha hechan hayu. In other words, the second part of the pasuk is telling you where these 4 rings were found. Vahavav, and the vav which is there, zo yisei rahi, right? It's extra. In other words, it doesn't have the meaning that a vav traditionally has. Upitrono kimo shtei tabaos. Right? In other words, Rashi says you should understand it, you should read it as if the vav wasn't there. Therefore, what does the English do? The English leaves out the word and. And the English says, right, comma, 2 rings, because the way the English translates it is the way Rashi understands it, which is simply to say that there were 4 rings in total. The first part of the pasuk tells you that. The second part of the pasuk tells you where those 4 rings were.
That's a little dangerous to sort of like that, because the tradition is every oath needs something.
It's a good point, right? Right? It's a good point. I mean, it's a good point, which is why the Ibn Ezra comes up with his interpretation. Now, Ein Achinami, the Ibn Ezra is a unique interpretation.
I love it.
Right? None of the other Mefarshim go like the Ibn Ezra. Right? And one of the few times I see the Ramban says Rashi's right, not the Ibn Ezra. But you see, right, the Ibn Ezra has a very unique interpretation here, based on, and he's got something to hang his hat on. The Ramban goes out of his way to explain that the reason the Ibn Ezra never found the word pa'am meaning corner is because it doesn't really mean corner, right? It means the way in which they walked. And the Ramban brings psukim to indicate that it's connected to the way in which a person walks.
Not
And
to destruction.
correct.
Wait.
Yes.
Is it possible that you mentioned that if you put the badim through the feet part, right, and you walk with it, it became higher and more visible?
It did become higher and more visible, but it was covered. So when they traveled, the Aron Kodesh was covered. It was not,
I'm thinking when we went to war,
yeah.
as in another way of carrying it, plan B, it became much more manifest
To the enemy.
the enemy.
And also to the Jews to inspire them.
It became
Interesting suggestion.
Like an alternative way of carrying it on alternative circumstances.
Interesting suggestion, okay? But I wanted you to see these, right? I wanted you to see these two interpretations, right? The Rashi, who seems to be the mainstream interpretation, and the Ibn Ezra, because the question of whether the Aron Kodesh sat on the ground or not is an interesting question, right? We never think about that, but that's an interesting question. Maybe some kind of padding, maybe something else. I don't know. We don't have any reference to it, but the Ibn Ezra makes sense when he says feet, right?
Or did you, maybe I asked the last year, I don't remember, was it made a box into a box? In other words, the table itself, was it?
It was 3 boxes. It was a gold box, a wood box, and a gold box.
Okay. So you could say that the 3 boxes is, the core of the box was the middle box where everything holy was put in, and that the box, the table itself was the exterior part, and that didn't have the same holiness, and you could put it on the ground.
Okay, I hear that.
Whereas the inside is really the essence.
I mean, and it's being separated, you say. I hear that. I hear that. It's an interesting halacha. Tina mentions it. I actually never related it to, until right now. You know, you go to a wedding. Sometimes you go to a wedding, and at the tish, they give out these small mincha books. You know, mincha mariv sidurim. They're not really sidurim. They're like little, and people keep them. You know, they keep them in their pocket when they, you know. Today, a lot of people daven from their phone, but you know. So what happens? I see men. They put it in their wallets. What happens when they go into the bathroom? Right. What happens when they go into the bathroom?
It has to be covered.
It has to have 2 covers. It has to have 2 covers, right? So generally, there's a plastic cover on it, and then it's tucked into the wallet, and that's the 2 covers, right? That's the 2 covers on it. So maybe, Tina, here were 2 covers to the inner kedusha, and there were 2 covers. Maybe an interesting question.
Years ago, one of the jewelry things was a mezuzah. Years ago, not so much now, that was the and it was a question that was asked, you go to the bathroom, you have a real clock in there, what do you do?
Nobody could put a kosher cloth in them. This isn't that small. Okay, so now,
The shema too, right?
right? So let's go on and let's look and see the next sentence. What does the next sentence say? So the next pasuk the Torah tells us, "V'asisa badei atzei shitim," right? The staves were made out of what? Acacia wood. Acacia wood is very strong. They were made out of acacia wood. V'tzipisa osam zahav, and they were covered with gold. Right? Again, they have to bear the weight of the Aron Kodesh, so they were covered with gold. What's interesting is that the Aron Kodesh, maybe to answer Mike's question, Mike, the Aron Kodesh carried its carriers, right? In other words, by a miraculous kind of way, the Aron Kodesh sort of lifted up those who were carrying it. So maybe the rings didn't have to bear the weight of the Aron Kodesh, and maybe, and listen, who knows, in all possibilities, the Aron Kodesh, maybe it just hovered over the ground. We don't know.
I thought that was always a metaphor. Is that really supposed to
No,
be?
correct,
I know
yes.
they say that, it's not so much that Jews kept Shabbos, but the Shabbos.
Well,
kept the Jews. That's a
right,
metaphor.
correct. Okay,
But
so,
if there was a child who walks, let's say, and you wanted to-
Chai noseas atzmo, right? Chai noseas atzmo. A little bit, somewhat related with that. Okay, look here. The pasuk says that you would take these badim vehevesa es habadim batabaos al tzalo haaron laseis es haaron bahem. Okay, you put the staves through the aron. Now, how long were these staves? Do we have a measurement of how long the staves were here in the Chumash? Doesn't tell us how long the staves were.
They also don't say how big the rings are, but the
Right.
staves have to be somewhat thick to support the weight, so they have to be.
If we assume that there was a particular weight, yes, you're right. Okay. But let's look now. Now go to this, right? Go to this picture, right? If we're looking at this picture, so just again to orient ourselves, we are looking down, right? We're flying above the Mishkan. We're looking down into the Kodesh HaKadashim. Normally, you couldn't look down because there were coverings on top. They've been removed for the purpose of our being able to see this. And here is the Aron, and here are the staves, right? If you look at it, the staves go literally from wall to wall, literally wall to wall. By the way, how big was the Kodesh HaKadashim? It was a perfect square or a cube of 10 by 10. 10 amos by 10 amos. Right? 10 amos is 15 feet? 15 feet?
15 feet.
15 feet by 15 feet. It was a cube of 15, well, I guess a cube or square, I'm not sure. 15 feet by 15 feet. Well, it's not so big. And the Aron, right, the Aron fit in there, and the Badim went literally from one end of the Aron, from one end of the Kodesh HaKadashim to the other. In fact, the Gemara in Menachos says they even butted up against the curtain. They stuck out a little bit, that the rods pushed the curtain a little bit. So you could see the protrusion of the rods sort of through the curtains. That's how they were put, right? That's how they were put into the... Now, what's interesting here is, let's think about what happened in that Kodesh HaKodashim. What happened? On Yom Kippurim, what happened?
You believe about the Avodah, right? Okay.
What happened?
At the time of Mishkan, it was exactly the same as Beit HaMikdash.
Well, at the time of the Mishkan, it was different than the Beis HaMikdash, because the construction was different. What happened? What did he do?
He would bring in a censer.
He would bring in a censer with what? Right, with coals, and he would bring in a ladle with incense, right? And he would pour the incense onto the hot coals, and that would create a cloud. Where would he do that?
In the Kodesh Kodashim.
Where in the Kodesh HaKodashim?
Where
In the one corner.
Right. So looking at this picture, it seems that he would have to do it in a corner, right? No. Where did he do it? He did it between the staves.
Oh, he walked in between.
Here's the question, Chevra.
How did he get there?
How did he get there?
Supports Evan Ezra.
How did he get there?
Supports Evan Ezra.
Well,
That's right
through
over.
the curtain.
No, but if you look,
Everything is closed here.
right? How did he get between the staves?
How do you get into the room in the first place?
He said two people could get there.
How did he get into the room in the first place?
You don't do it.
Right? It's interesting question. Well, there's a curtain. This was a curtain.
The staves are thicker in the end. So how do we get through the rings?
Ah, so an interesting question, right? If you look at the picture here, you see that the staves were thicker at the ends than they were in the middle,
So the rings had to be
right?
very large.
So the question is why? Why is that? And I mean, by the way, if you look at the art scroll, you don't see that. If you look at the picture in the art scroll, you don't see that.
It said it's permanent, so it can't slide out once.
Oh, not only so that it can't slide out, but it wouldn't move when they were carrying it. In other words, if you're carrying it and it's not like this, but rather it's all a uniform diameter, what's the possibility? It'll slide back and forth. But if you have it like this, it's not sliding anywhere. But this now begs Les's question, which is, how did they do that? So you would have to answer, the wood was not a different diameter. The wood was the same diameter. In other words, they put the wood through the rings, and after the wood was in the rings, they then coated it with gold, and they coated the part that was to the external side of the rings with more gold to make it thicker. Right, but excellent question. So what we have here is a picture where you see a curtain dividing between the Holy and the Holy of Holies, between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodashim. In the first Beis HaMikdash, there was a wall with a doorway between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodashim. In the second Beis HaMikdash, there was a curtain, again, between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodashim. Because the wall between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodashim could only be an amma thick. How big is an amma?
18 inches.
Right? It was an amma thick, right? 18 was it an amma, I think, or? I think it was an amma. Hold on a second. I'll give that to you in a second.
For a door.
Hang on a second. I'll tell you in a second how big it was. Okay, let's see. So the... Okay. So the wall was... yeah, the wall was an amma thick, right? So that means 18 inches thick, which is a pretty thick wall, right? Pretty thick wall. How thick is the average wall? I don't know. How thick is the average wall? 2 by 4 and, all right? But it seems that the second Beis HaMikdash was much taller than the first Beis HaMikdash. And there was a difficulty in making such a wall that size. So instead they used a curtain. They actually used a double curtain. And the Kohen walked like in between the curtains like that. So this was only in the Mishkan do we see this, because in the first Beis HaMikdash there was a wall, not a curtain. In the second Beis HaMikdash there was a curtain, but no Aron Kodesh. There was no Aron Kodesh in the second Beis HaMikdash. There was no Aron Kodesh in the second Beis HaMikdash. No. There was no Aron Kodesh in the second Beis HaMikdash. The Aron Kodesh was hidden away before the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. The Aron Kodesh was hidden away in one of the underground tunnels under Har Habayis.
We don't know where it is.
We're not telling, right? In one of the underground tunnels underneath Har Habayis. Who was the king who hid it away? Yoshia, maybe? I'm not sure. Who? I don't think so. And in the second Beis HaMikdash, there was no Aron Kodesh. So this curtain and Aron Kodesh combination only existed in the Mishkan, right? In the Beis HaMikdash, first Beis HaMikdash, you had a wall and an Aron Kodesh. Second Beis HaMikdash, you had a curtain, but no Aron Kodesh.
So why did the Kohen have to do in the second temple period if he was going?
He put the incense in the same place where it would have been in the first Beis HaMikdash, but there was no Aron Kodesh.
How come they didn't try to make another one?
Because what went inside the Aron Kodesh?
The luchos, the broken luchos,
And the regular luchos.
and the regular luchos.
What do you need another Aron Kodesh for if there's no luchos? Okay.
I'm getting mixed up with what we have here now, the Aron Kodesh.
Don't focus on that. Okay, so we'll stop here for tonight, and I think gave you some interesting things to think about.